Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I think my wife's jealous. She's originally from Southern California and moved to Boston, and after our winter last year, she really wanted to move back here. So I'm going to start off my talk with just a question, and that's, in just a few words, what comes to mind as you hear the words disruptive innovation? And you can just enter those words into your iPads or if you have your own device. And if you're someone like me and you like to stir things up, this may bring positive connotations, but for many people, the terms disruptive innovation have often been used as kind of a club to say, you know, there's these changes you don't like, suck it up, it's disruptive innovation. So, so I want to get, an honest assessment of what's, what comes to mind whenever people hear those terms. So Netflix, stirring up the status quo, quick and uneven change, higher education, uncomfortable, something different. Keys moving, who moved my keys? that book, right? The Journey to the Promised Land, scary and exciting at the same time. New paradigms, out with the old, in with the new. Out of the box thinking. Okay, run the other way. I like that one. So, faster than the speeding light. New ways of doing things upset the proverbial apple cart. Okay. So a lot of my background is in disruptive innovation. I co-founded a research group with one of the fathers of the internet at MIT, focused on how internet telephony was disrupting the telecommunications carriers. And I'm going to just give a brief overview of disruptive innovation theory. So the computer industry is one of the best understood on disruptive innovation. So the term itself was coined by Clayton Christensen, who was actually, whenever I was co-founding this research group at MIT, he was just an upstart at Harvard, and now he's the most quoted management guru in the world after Peter Drucker. So he's come a long way. But you started off with a small market with very expensive products, and that's the small circle, so mainframes. And then you disrupted that. So PCs disrupted mainframes, and you have an order of magnitude decrease in cost, and order of magnitude or more increase of users. And now PCs are getting disrupted by mobile. Right? So that's one of the best understood examples. But many people, including Clayton Christensen, have argued that higher education is about to go through a similar disruption, where you start with traditional higher education that's serving a limited market, and then you had the first wave of disruption where you had online education, and I'm calling that traditional online education. You had community college, you had higher education in emerging markets like developing countries, and you had for-profits. So each of those expanded the reach. In some cases, they decreased the cost significantly. In some cases, not as much. But what I would argue is that we're getting ready to go through a third wave, that there's two parts of that. One is the rapid growth in emerging markets, so especially in developing countries of higher education. I'll talk more about that. And then there's this other thing on the technology level that I have this very easy to say name, adaptive competency-based education ecosystems, which is basically a placeholder for there's this new thing that's coming, but I think it's going to have some of these aspects as a part of it. So when people talk about disruptive innovation, the most often diagram they use to describe it is this. So basically, if you take a technology and its performance over time, and one of the best examples was digital cameras. Who here bought one of the first really bad digital cameras? It was like me, yeah. And you took a picture and you're like, I still have a picture of my mom where you can barely even tell it's my mom, right? Because the resolution was so bad. So the first digital cameras were just horrible, right? So they weren't even as good as the disposable camera. So this might be the disposable camera market. And then the next are the cheap point and click, and these are pretty much all I ever bought. I never, bought those other ones. But you start off and it's really bad, but gradually it's on a different curve than these other things. So it increases dramatically, and often there's some sort of technology behind that, a technology core that enables that to happen. And often it'll also combine off-the-shelf components to where now, the camera that I have on my iPhone, which is like a $10 chip, is better than any of the cameras I ever bought before. And it's not only better, but it makes it easy for me to get my photos onto Facebook, which is the main thing I use it for, right? So that's kind of an example of disruption. There's a lot of other examples out there. So you have travel agents got completely disrupted. You have someone put Netflix as an example, Netflix versus Blockbuster or television. Newspapers got disrupted, e-readers. And if you look at, where's higher education in this curve, online education, I would say, is somewhere between this low quality use and medium quality use. So it started off, pretty bad in the, 1990s. There are some people who are doing bulletin board based online education. That was really bad, I think. So, but now a lot of the low quality schools are closing because there's other options. They're essentially being disrupted. So the theory would say that there's a possibility that it would continue. It's a theory. It's not a guaranteed, right? But the theory would say that there's a possibility that this disruption could continue. And it may be that whenever it continues, it may not be called online education. We may view the term online education kind of like we view the term the horseless carriage. It may be something that is so different once it actually happens. So, as Michael mentioned, I've talked with a lot of CCCU schools, and APU honestly is doing better than just about any of the ones that I can think of. The fact that you all separated out University College as a semi-autonomous division is one of the things. The number one thing that Clayton Christensen advises and disruptive innovation theory says is basically the same thing that Jesus said 2,000 years ago. He said you need a new wine or new wineskin for new wine, right? And Clayton Christensen, came up with this elaborate theory, disruptive innovation, to say the same thing. But what he studied, hundreds of industries, and across all the industries, he said the only incubants that ever successfully managed disruption, it was by creating something separate. So there's a lot of reasons for that. But so the challenge is with that. There's going to be a couple challenges with that. One is that University College doesn't become ghettoized, where it's like a second-class citizen. It needs to be separate, but it needs to not be the isolated. It needs to be separate but accepted. Put it that way. The growth. Whenever I talked with Michael and saw that you all are planning significant growth for online, that's exactly what schools that are going to survive the disruption would be doing. So growing from 10% to 36%. The challenge is going to be what a lot of schools that I've talked with have done is instead of investing your profitable growth back into more profitable growth, a lot of schools will kind of eat the goose that lays the golden eggs, and many schools actually can't resist the temptation to reintegrate back their, and I've seen some schools that they separated a separate division, then they reintegrated it, and then it quit growing. And then the other is, eventually you guys are going to be experiencing a lot of price competition, especially from state schools, Arizona State, other schools along those lines. The first wave, there wasn't as much competition, but as competition heats up and you start to get these schools, Arizona State their goal is to have 100,000 students. Once they have 100,000 students, they can afford to compete on price because their marginal cost per student is pretty low. And then, having the core competencies of growth. I've seen a lot of schools that also, they'll outsource all their marketing to a vendor, and then that vendor leaves, and then they've lost their engine for growth. So the other things you guys are doing, so you're investing in practical degrees with high quality or high growth potential like nursing, and you have a focus on diversity. And one of the things you guys have going for you is you're in Southern California, and the challenge is going to be to address issues of social class in addition to race. So this is the chart. Michael alluded to. There's a lot of changes that are happening, and it's kind of like the perfect storm in terms of the technology changes, the competitive changes, the demographic changes. A lot of Christian schools have looked at this chart, which is Christian colleges historically have focused largely on a white, non-Hispanic market. And that market, and you can see this is the number of high school graduates by year. You can see that market grew right up until the year 2008, which you started to see 2008, where you started to see a decline. And at the same time, though, you're seeing a dramatic increase of the number of Latino students. So where a lot of CCCU schools, they don't really have a plan B because this was their only market, and they're in a place where they don't have a growth market. You all do have significant growth market, but the challenge is going to be that serving this market really requires a new model. It's a new wineskin type approach, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. I was just meeting with Eastern University. They have Esperanza, which is kind of a Christian community college for Latino students, and I think that's one good approach for that. So If you look at this college access, and our focus is really, for City Vision, our focus is on the bottom half. So what this chart here shows is who's getting a degree across time, so 1965 until 2020, and this is the top 25% income-wise. And you had significant growth for that group, 37-point growth, and then 19-point growth for the next year. So all this is the top half. And the challenge has been that the bottom half basically hasn't had hardly any growth for the past 50 years. And the reason why a lot of schools are struggling is that this market's starting to get saturated. You can get a little bit more growth out of this, but the market's starting to get saturated. This market, there's some growth, but these are the people who are middle class and can't afford to pay full tuition. And then, so everyone's focusing on this group, but this is the disruptive innovation opportunity down here. So if you look at Southwest Airlines, whenever it got started, it said its competition wasn't other airlines. Its competition was the car. So what a lot of disruptive innovation, you're competing with what they say non-consumption. So you're competing with people who wouldn't even use the product. So that's where disruptive innovators come from, is they come from competing with non-consumption. So the bigger opportunity, so that's in the US. The bottom half, I think, is where you're going to see some of the disruptive innovation come from in the United States. But the bigger opportunity is globally. So globally, there was 100 million students in 2000. And then by 2025, there's going to be 263 million students. So 84% of that growth is in the developing world. And what that means is you're talking about 137 million new students in developing countries by 2025. So there is this dramatic shift happening in higher education, and it's interesting to think about. It took 1,000 years, so higher education's been around for roughly 1,000 years. It took 1,000 years to get to the first 100 million, and then it's taking less than 25 to get to 263 million. So the growth is exploding in higher education. So there's, part of the goal of this presentation is to get you to reframe the world and to think about, what's happening in the world. And I think this is the picture of the world that we need to get used to, which, we like to look at the map where North America and Europe's in the center because we're in the center of the world, right? But if you look at the growth, this is really where the growth of the world is going to be. And Jesus said, I do what I see the Father doing. So the question is, what is God doing? And there's been a lot of people who've, I think it was Jenkins who talked about the rise of the global south, and Todd Johnson, he is the big Christian statistician. He says that by 2025, 69% of global Christendom will be in non-Western countries, but 99% of the growth will be in non-Western countries. So what business in the world would have 99% of its growth, if all of a sudden 99% of Apple's growth is outside of the United States, where would it invest its resources? It would be investing its resources outside the United States. That's what's happening right now with all the investment in China and places where there is significant growth. And I think that that's something that Christians need to be thinking about. So that brings up the first discussion. So I want us to have a discussion to try to get us thinking about out-of-the-box thinking. So the same types of mindsets that will help you in thinking about, okay, how do we solve our current issues that we have here at APU? I think that it'd be helpful to ask this question. So for the next discussion, what I want to do is I want to talk through this question. So let's assume Christian higher education is about 5% of the global market. And as the global market grows from 100 million students, which 5 million in Christian higher education in 2000, to 263 in 2025, just to keep pace and not lose market share, Christian higher education globally would need to grow to 13.25 million. So 163% growth. So there's two questions, and this is where we're going to have discussions at the table. And this is, the idea is to be, brainstorming. So the first question is, what role can Western Christian higher education play to help global Christian higher education grow to meet that? If you're trying to meet that demand, let's just say we're trying to keep up with the market growth overall. And then specifically, just brainstorming ideas for how APU in general, and your division in particular, might play a role in helping the global body of Christ reach that goal. So let's take about 5 or 6 minutes and then discuss, and then what we'll do if you want, you could have someone be the note taker and put the notes in on your table, or you could each enter in your own notes. But why don't we take a few minutes and discuss those two questions, and then we'll come back. One of the reasons why I wanted us to go through this is, one, just to get everyone thinking about out-of-the-box thinking. So you have to change the wineskin to start thinking about this problem. So it helps us, in doing that. The other is, I think that this is an inspirational problem in my mind, and I think that gets creativity going, an inspirational problem. There's a lot of comments, understanding the local worldview, what's God doing there already. Let's see, meeting needs of people, where they are teaching. I heard a lot about indigenous leadership development. Part of what we talked about at our table was you want to start with a Christian worldview, and you want to, combine that with whatever the local needs are. So I think, we're all coming at some of these things. I want to also just pause on this and, getting kind of back to the inspiration. I want to tell you where my own passion for disruptive innovation, many of you have probably heard the talk by Simon Sinek about Start With Why. I want to tell you my why on this stuff. So, Michael told you about my background and, these, normal things you hear in academic backgrounds. But part of my story is I grew up poor in inner city Kansas City, where all my friends, everyone I knew was experiencing extreme abuse. Everyone I knew was using drugs, addicted. Many of them went to jail. And they were on a path to a living hell. And for me, my ticket out was education. So I, became a workaholic. I became an overachiever in many ways, my life story. So I went to MIT. I, excelled there at MIT. If you've seen the movie Good Will Hunting, I was basically Matt Damon's character in that movie. And, but I also learned the limits of education by itself, because you take an educated kid from the hood who's a juvenile delinquent, and then you move him to the suburbs, like happened with me, and what do? You get an educated juvenile delinquent. So in high school, I became a computer hacker and narrowly avoided going to jail whenever our leader went to jail, and I never heard from him again. But that was kind of a wake-up call. And then the same thing, happened at MIT. I was driven. I was a workaholic. I basically became miserable. And I realized that being educated, taking someone who's poor and miserable, making them rich and miserable, isn't transforming. That's education maybe by itself, but it's not transformative education. So I had to go through 10 years of transformation. So for me, my passion on this comes in really what I think of disruptive innovation. So I was friends with Andy Crouch whenever he was in Cambridge, before he became this big name editor of Christianity Today, and wrote his book Culture Makers, where what he says we shouldn't be cultural critics, we should be cultural makers, right? And I have the kind of geek tech counterpart to that, and instead of being systems critics, we should be systems makers. And that's really what disruptive innovation is about. It's about how do you make a new system to address these types of problems. It's about the problem of what got you here won't get you there. So you guys realize that with creating University College. And I think that there's a sequence of these throughout our lives where what got you here, God says, now there's something new. And what we're trying to do is approach this type of problem, which I think is an interesting opportunity. And I think it's one of the most interesting opportunities in the history of Christian higher education. So that's part of why I wanted to get you to think about that. But also, I think some of the creative problem solving you do in that could also help on the day-to-day problems too. So I'm going to go into getting back to talking about disruptive innovation, and many of you have seen this adoption cycle graph. So smartphones is a good example for this. So how many of you were among the innovators and the early adopters for pre-smartphones, where you got one of the Palm Pilots? Who here got a Palm Pilot? Okay, so we got a lot of geeks in this room, right? Did anyone get a Newton? Do we have some Uber geeks? Okay, we got an Uber geek. All right. So, there's always one person who, I got the Palm Pilot. I had the Trio. I had the original Windows smartphone that you had to click on the start menu to get to and those things were clunky. And Jeffrey Moore came up with this term called the chasm. And the idea is the culture you need to serve the geeks is very different from the culture that you need to serve the average person. So what happened in smartphones is Apple came, and this is what Apple specializes in. They're not the first. They just show everyone how to do it right for the average person, right? So they came in and they said, here's how the smartphone should be done, and then Android saw what they did and they copied it quickly, basically is what happened. So, but then they were able to capture the early majority. Now the question is, where are we in higher education? So if you look at the degree as an innovation and an adoption cycle, the US average for degrees, we're not yet to 50% attainment in the United States. So we're still on this side of the bell curve. But what I would argue is that higher education is not a single market, but it's multiple markets with different needs. Now, if you look at the different markets, and I showed you those income quartiles, there's a top income quartile which is saturated. And most companies don't want to be in a market, and this is where the PC market is here right now. You know, it's not that many people want PCs, not everyone has a PC, but the market's not growing tremendously. And that's, you know, for those who are in the top income quartile. Then you have the third income quartile where they're not yet to 50%. They're pretty close, but that quartile is actually, the growth is going to decrease. And then you got the first and second income quartile and the global average. What I would argue is that there's going to be a crossing the chasm here. There's going to be new approaches to this, and I'll talk a little bit about what I think those new approaches would look like. But to use another example, so this is innovation extension curve, and this is basically showing you the same diagram, except it's overlapping diagrams. So you take something like the Mac, and the PC market is declining now, right? But Apple was brilliant, and right around the point that the PC market had peaked, they said, we need to reinvent ourselves, and we're going to center around the iPod. They continued in this market. They didn't say, I mean, they still sell Macs, it's just not their growth product, right? And iPod became their growth product. And then right around the time that iPod had peaked, they invented the iPhone. And then iPhone is still, you know, doing, and you know, there's a question now, is iPhone starting to peak? And Steve Jobs isn't around to do the magic, so what's going to happen, you know? So I would argue that it's the same type of thing happening in higher education. So you had traditional higher education, the first wave. Then you have traditional online education, the second wave. And there's this third wave that I'm giving a very, you know, easy to say name, adaptive competency-based education in emerging markets. But it's this next thing. And that's really what we're trying to do with City Vision is we're trying to create a new wineskin that's focused on this third innovation in the emerging market. So our school, the history of our school, we grew out of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. You have Union Rescue Mission here near in LA. And our students, half of our students originally, so this is, you know, the non-consumption, not people you typically associate with college. Half of our students were people who were formerly homeless. The other half were people who are serving the homeless. Some of the stats about our school, so of our students currently, 79% are Pell eligible who apply for aid, 41% are people of color. With that population, we have a 58% graduation rate, which is pretty high considering that community colleges that don't even serve that at-risk of population have a 39% graduation rate. For our graduates, 91% are placed in job or go on to education. And right now, our undiscounted tuition is $6,000 per year, which makes most of our online programs the lowest cost Christian online program of their type. And between the fall of 2014 and 2015, our enrollment grew by about 36%. So before you get impressed by all that, right now we only have a total of 160 students in our school, but we hope to continue that growth. And I would argue that the program that I just described, I would still put in the category of traditional online because it's not that, we're not trying to be disruptive. This is what we're doing that we're trying to be disruptive. So $5,000, a 4-year degree, $2,000 for a 2-year degree. We've partnered with Sailor Academy, is kind of like Khan Academy, but it has the first 2 years of college for free, and they recently just got ACE accredited for that. We did some things with international accreditation for them that lets us use 3 years. So the way it works is they're getting 3 years through that. And you know, a lot of it's independent study, but if you start with 1 million students and you end up with 10,000 or 100,000 through independent study, that's still 10,000 or 100,000 students that go through it. And then we provide the last year that is fully faculty-led instruction. So the reason why we did that is because there's a phrase in disruptive innovation: if you don't eat your lunch, then someone else will. So we decided to try to eat our own lunch because we realized that we needed to do that. And we've done things creatively with pricing so that we're not undercutting our own pricing. Michael said, I can't find the link to your $5,000 degree on your homepage. And I said, well, that's because I'm advertising the $6,000 degree on the homepage, and I'm marketing this to another market. We're targeting to the international market. We have partnerships in Kenya. We have partnerships in the United Arab Emirates. And I'm in discussions with an Indian university that has about 30,000 students that is interested in potentially partnering with us. So that's some of how we're trying to create a new wineskin for this third wave. The long-term vision of what we're wanting to do is this year we're trying to get to 250 students with about a $3,000 marginal cost per student. So I'm using an economics term, which is how much does it cost us to serve one more student. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to about $1,000 a year, faculty-led courses, in terms of our marginal cost per student. And we're hoping that in doing that, we can get in the 10,000s of students internationally range. And part of the reason why we're doing that is, so I teach, one of the courses that I teach is bottom or base of the pyramid strategy course. And the basic idea behind bottom or base of the pyramid strategy is you got to start with a design price that in the base of the pyramid, it was a term that was coined by C.K. Prahalad, and he wrote a book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And the idea is that there's 5 billion people that are lower income, but those together have a lot of money. So there's a lot of people who've been left out of the higher education market. And if you look at the demographic trends, there's going to be billions more people added to the higher education. So there's a lot of strategy approaches to this. One of them is, the way higher education currently works is you say, here's all our cost, and then we're going to charge you a tuition based on that. So you start with cost, and then you add, your price on that. There's another approach, which is to start with price and say, how can I meet a price point that the bottom of the pyramid can afford? So that's essentially what we've done. And you have to do a lot of things. Ultimately, you got to get to scale. In online education, those of you who are at university college, and that's why you're trying to grow, is because once you grow to 5,000 or 10,000 students, then your cost per student goes down dramatically because your fixed costs are averaged across all those students. You have to de-skill a lot of the work. You have to do a lot of process innovation, and then you do innovation on hybrids. One of the groups I was talking with yesterday, they said, we're still going to need people on the ground, and our partnerships in Kenya and United Arab Emirates, we're delivering online classes, but we're using people on the ground to help them, kind of playing the role of the student advisor that you would have here, where people just call on the phone, but it's, there they need help getting on the internet and, things along those lines. And whenever the power goes out, that you need a place that has a backup supply and, things along those lines. So the reason why I, am presenting this, one is I think it's a good vision for Christian higher education to think about. I think that, you all could potentially look at this is something as a skunk works for a university college, but I think it also gets at some of the core problems that higher education's dealing with. So everyone's focused right now on what I would say are symptoms in higher education. So how is it that students can be complaining about our tuition's too high, and then faculty are complaining about we're not being paid enough? And I've asked the faculty, how much are you paid? They're not being paid enough, and the students are paying stuff too high. There's a reality to that, and it's not that there's mean people who are making bad decisions. There's some fundamental things in the economics that's happening, and then you have to do things that I call coping mechanisms. So you have a lot of adjuncts, you have administrative staff, you have teaching assistants, and here you guys are focused on lower teacher-student ratio, so you're not doing a lot of things that state schools are doing, like large lectures and standardized tests as much. But those are all symptoms of a larger problem. Who here has heard of the term Baumol's cost disease? Okay, so basically, I'll talk about it, and there's also a paper that was written on the economics of superstars. But those together, if you look at the people, and a part of my doctoral dissertation was focused on studying why are costs going up. And ultimately, the reason why costs are going up, if you look at the cost of highly skilled labor, and you compare the cost of higher education to the cost of doctors and lawyers and other highly skilled labor, they're all going up at about the same pace. And that's from these two things. And what Baumol's cost disease is really about is between 1500 and 2000, the average worker can do now the work of 60 workers in 1500. So you've had a 60 times increase of productivity. Now, can the average faculty member today do 60 times productivity in terms of teaching students as they did in 1500? Probably not. Or if you do, you're not doing very good education. That's the fundamental problem. And Baumol, who studied this, and he said that the price of a concert for quartet is going to be increased dramatically over hundreds of years because there's no way to increase the efficiency of 4 people playing an instrument for an hour because it's defined in the, and it's a little bit like that in higher education. So ultimately, I describe this kind of like a law of gravity. You can try to resist it, but really the only real way to resist it is one that's nonsensical, which was the Unabomber saying we need to go back to living in caves and get rid of all the productivity. That's not going to happen. Ultimately, what happens is all the other sectors, their productivity goes up, and then the end result is that the cost of sectors where the productivity doesn't go up increases. Does that make sense to folks? There's a lot more to it, but that's the quick summary. So, what's the solution? Solution, part of it is disruptive innovation. Part of it is some of these other things that people are doing, which are, trying to solve it. So, the biggest thing I would say in disruptive innovation is this term unbundling. Who's heard of the term unbundling before? Okay, a lot of you. So this is like the Uber tech group, so I like this group. So, in the tech world, you used to have IBM, they did everything, right? They did the chips, they did the computer operating system, and then that got unbundled. So Intel did the chips, Dell did the computer, Microsoft did the operating system. You buy your computer at Best Buy, and each of those compete across the bundle. And there's been a lot of other areas where there's been unbundling. So Netflix, I haven't had a cable subscription since 2000. I cut, people talking about cutting the cable, and I pay, my $10 Netflix subscription rather than cable TV. So online, it's unbundled all the components of newspapers, not just news. They unbundled the classifieds, they unbundled sports scores, movie times, all these things. Then iTunes is unbundled albums. So what a lot of people are looking at is how this is happening in higher education. So the model that is looked at probably the most is Western Governors. So because they've scaled to 60,000 students. Western Governors is actually founded by a Christian guy, Sam Smith, and I was co-presenting with him to this group of Christian college presidents on disruptive innovation. I talked to him a lot about his model, but basically with universities, it's traditionally been a vertically integrated market, and you have 4 things that you're bundling in a degree: knowledge acquisition, access to opportunity, so the credential, alumni networks, access to jobs, metacognition and skills, that's going to be your training if you're doing nursing, the practicum, your residency, and then the transformative experience, which is really the core of Christian higher education, and all those things are bundled. You could add on research, but for the degree, this is usually what students are buying in the undergraduate experience. Now, what's happening is that's getting unbundled. So Western Governors, what they said is we're not going to create, where possible, we're not going to create any content. We want to buy off-the-shelf components. So they tried to build most of their university based on paid courseware, and their exams where possible. They're outsourcing a good number of their exams. And what happens is the lecture becomes much more like the book market. The lecture and the college course market becomes much more like the book market. And then what they're doing is, for the access to opportunity, they're saying, you know what, we're not going to try to compete with Harvard. We're not going to try to have an elite brand. What we're going to do is we're going to try to align with employer competencies. We're going to also, I was just talking with someone about how they do their tech degrees. If you get a 4-year degree with them, you might get 3 tech certifications bundled with that whenever people are searching for jobs, they're not just searching for a bachelor's in IT, they're searching for a very specific tech certification. So that's increasing their marketability. So they're trying to disrupt that. And then the biggest area of focus has been around this metacognition and skills. And this is the part where you can't really replace the people, because if you do, then the people don't get deep knowledge. So what they've done is they've broken up the job of the faculty into 4 positions, essentially. And they say that there's the course mentors, and that's an adjunct subject matter expert, but it's become much more standardized. And then they have separate evaluators. And then they have student mentors, and I know that you all in University College have something similar to student mentors, but the difference with student mentors is they go with the student for their full 4 years if they're there for 4 years. And it requires a different skill to be a student mentor. Some faculty are brilliant. They might be great at teaching, but they may not be the best at just encouraging the students, or Christian colleges are probably the exception where that's going to be a better value. But there's some people where their whole job could just be to encourage people, and that's all they need to be good at. They don't need to be subject matter expert in anything. And then ultimately what you're doing is the program faculty or the instructional designer has become a super professor. So they're working with this team, and it requires new critical skills in tech and instructional design, and some of you here probably are playing this role as the super professor. And the result is that this person, they're not the ones teaching 1,000 students, but this is the most highly leveraged position, and there's a lot of other people who are supporting that person and teaching 1,000 students. So the most highly skilled, highly paid position is much more leveraged. Does that make sense? And you're increasing the overall faculty productivity. So I'm teaching you a model that you guys are doing here in many cases. But I'm trying to break out how University College is not University College, how Western Governors model can be broken down. So this is what we're doing at City Vision. If there's any one thing that, the secret sauce of what we're doing in City Vision, this is probably the diagram for that. So what we're doing is for knowledge acquisition, so we have some courses that we create ourselves, but then there's a lot of courses that we get open education, so Saylor Academy, that's all open education resources. So MOOCs for us, MOOCs we view as books. They're not revolutionary. They're a component that can be added in with classes. So I'm teaching a course on entrepreneurship. I've assigned a MOOC that's 40% of the grade, and they can show me that they've completed that MOOC, and I'm using that instead of a textbook. So apps, the same type of thing. And books and paid courseware, I know you all use McGraw-Hill and Pearson, where instead of you just buying the book, you get the book along with a full course. We're investing big in prior learning assessment, and then we also have partnered with these alternative education providers like Straighterline and Saylor, where they provide ACE credit. So Straighterline came out with their tagline was freshman year for $1,000, and I was just talking to some people. Michael Clifford, who created Grand Canyon, he just came out with something called the Dream Degree, and it's freshman year for free. And the way he's going to make his money is he's going to charge for student acquisition. So the college will pay to get those students, and there's going to be colleges that will pay for those students. And I actually think in the long haul, the colleges might bid based on the quality of the students. So the students who are A+ students might cost you $2,000, and the students who are C students might be like a dime a dozen. So, I don't think he's going to price that way, but I wouldn't be surprised to see in the long term if that's the way the pricing works out. So in the access to opportunity, we're pursuing a strategy fairly similar to Western Governors. We're also investing a lot more in like LinkedIn and e-portfolios, where as the students do work, they're doing, if it's not just going to be our brand will get them somewhere, but it's not going to get them nearly as far as if they go to an elite school. They have to figure out how do you design your LinkedIn portfolio so that it's search engine optimized whenever people are searching for jobs and things along those lines. And then metacognition and skills, we're doing things that's probably pretty similar to what you guys are doing at University College. We put a strong emphasis on internships and externships. About a third of our students are doing those. Ultimately what makes a Christian education Christian isn't that you have a bunch of random Christian courses, it's that the whole thing's cohesive in a Christian worldview. So you have to have a Christian architect of the entire program, so the Christian worldview program designers. And then part of what we're seeing, and we're adding this on now, one of the flaws I would say in the long term of online education is that it's easier to do the lower levels of Bloom's. It can be harder to do the higher levels of Bloom's, so you have to have courses that are particularly focused on, how do you pull together all the pieces, so putting capstone integration. And this is, I would say, the other part of the secret sauce for us. So what's the most transformative organization in the world? It's the church, right? So if you're looking at unbundling, a big part of our strategy is how do we partner with churches? Churches, they lose a lot of, this is a big concern for a lot of churches. They send their people off to college and they only get a third of them, a lot of them lose their faith in that. So if you can start to, bundle education in with the church, then that starts to become interesting. Same thing we're doing with ministries. We also, our partnerships internationally, I mentioned, even though we're doing online degrees, we're doing it with blended learning because online degrees in Kenya are not really a concept that people understand and the infrastructure isn't yet there. And then we also have courses that are transformative. So I'm going to do a couple more slides just to explain why the unbundling is going to have to happen and where the competition is going to come from. This is a slide that I borrowed from EduVentures, part of it, and then a lot of it I recreated myself. So whenever you look at the modes of education, you have high-tech, low-touch up here. So that's things like MOOCs, correspondence courses, and then you have low-tech, high-touch down here that, classroom instruction, ultimately the ideal, if we could have education, we'd all have one-to-one tutors, right? It's just not affordable. And on this side of the diagram is the pace of personalization. So here you have things that's completely static, correspondence course doesn't change. You're just mailing them and stuff. Online courses don't change that often. But face-to-face tutoring, you can make adjustments, fairly quickly. But even more than that would be Khan Academy. So who's here seen the knowledge map or the knowledge graph on Khan Academy, where they'll figure out where you're deficient, and then they'll adjust the questions. If you're trying to multiply fractions and you don't understand numerator denominator, they're going to put you back to understanding numerator denominator. So that's, moving up this is mastery-based, competency-based education. So that's part of what makes Western Governors interesting. But up here, there's this adaptive CBE ecosystem, this term that I keep using that people are like, what are you talking about? And the only example I could really point to that is the future is Duolingo. So Duolingo, they have 120 million users. If you haven't used it, it's an app. It teaches people languages. It's completely free. I'm convinced that in our lifetime, they will probably teach over 1 billion people how to speak another language. They're probably going to invest over $1 billion in developing their app. No one's going to be able to compete with them because they're going to have $1 billion invested, and they have a good revenue stream for that. And I think that, ultimately, whenever you can get a component that someone invested $1 billion of, why not use that as one of your Lego bricks in your education? So we're using Duolingo right now to replace TOEFL, but in the future we'll use it for our intro language courses, for teaching languages. And then, over here for the MOOCs and apps, so what's interesting here is you have high fixed cost, very high fixed cost, but on both of these, a low per student cost. So those become more interesting as Lego bricks to put into your courses. And then, down at the bottom, what you're talking about is technology-assisted instruction. So you're trying to enhance outcomes. That's the core of what APU is about. But there's this human-assisted technology platform. This is going to be access for the masses. Now, there's a lot of people who say if we can't do it the right way, we shouldn't do it at all. Well, that's like saying if the poor in Ethiopia or some other place can't eat organic food, then we should just let them starve. There's a lot of the world that doesn't have access to education. You need to give them, and it is going to be better here. And I think as time goes on, you have to figure about not just feeding people, but feeding them the highest nutrition, educational content. And that's what the long-term battle is going to be about. So does that make sense to folks? All right. So I'm going to go into specific recommendations. So you guys see your future's tied to are you going to be successful in serving Latino communities? So, there's this term, I think, do you guys use the same term, inclusive excellence here? And so Arizona State, I saw use something very similar to inclusive excellence. Arizona State, they are probably the best model that I've seen out there. So they have 40% low-income students, so they reflect the demographics of Arizona. They have 90%, close to 90% freshman retention, and they have, I think, about 58% graduation rate. So given their demographics, they're doing a tremendous job. And part of what they've done is they've used technology to do that. So I've been trying to reverse engineer how they're doing it. The book that their president wrote was not good. Way to do that. Yeah, everyone here agrees. But I've been looking at some dissertations that's been written by some EdD people that basically reverse engineer their program, and I think that would be a program that's worth looking at. One thing that I'd love to talk with people at University College about is, could we partner on a skunk works, and trying to have a price that's affordable for developing countries, or you could do something that's your own. I've talked with some schools. They're looking at how do we do a mobile degree. They've said, let's scope out a mobile degree for China. I'm skeptical that you can do an entire degree mobile, but I think the largest portion of it on mobile is probably not a bad way to go.
Well, Japan's doing it, right?
Right, yeah. Right. And the Dream degree is entirely mobile based. So you get the first year for free. But obviously if you're going to do that, I mean, part of what you can do, innovative pricing, Christian organizations who work in the developing world almost always have a three-tiered pricing. They have tier 1 world, or countries, tier 2 countries, tier 3 countries. It's fairly simple to do that. You don't have to undercut yourself in terms of your pricing, but ultimately what you have to do is you have to be able to get the marginal cost for University College so you're not losing money with those students. But if you're able to scale up, then there's ways that you can probably get your marginal cost there. And the other thing is just expanding expertise and core competencies. We teach our students and we say every degree that you do, if you're in biology, you're not a biology student anymore. You're a biology and a bioinformatics student. The biology researchers that don't learn bioinformatics are going to be handicapped. They're not going to be able to do 1/100th of the researcher that biology. My wife did her PhD in biology at MIT, so I know this. And it's like that in every field, where if you don't learn tech, then you're just not going to keep up. You're going to be like the farmer who's the plowman and you don't know how to use a tractor. And the guy with the tractor is going to get the job. And the person who's you can be the strongest plowman out there. If you don't know how to use the tractor, you're not going to keep up. And ultimately, it's about that. How do you get that as a core competency through the whole school? So anyway, I'll stop with that and open up for questions. But hopefully some of this has been helpful and sparked some thoughts and some ideas and things along those lines. So, and I didn't mention that I actually have an online course that it's on Udemy, iTunes U, YouTube, and SlideShare. And I have 5.5 hours of material on this. So I mean, my dissertation was in this space, and then I decided rather than put it into a book that I do what you do in disruption. You don't use the traditional way you do. And that way, whenever something new comes out, I just release a new section. I just did another one on case studies, and then I'm going to do one on, I waited to do my section on Christian until I had the conversations with you all, because I want to have more dialogue, and the more conversations I have, the better I think the material gets. But I cover kind of all these different concepts, I guess. So, I mean, you want to do a lot of experiments. So one of the sections I talk about is lean startup for education. So the idea on lean startup is you do a ton of experiments, and then you see what works. If you invest everything in one experiment, then if it's like anything else, that experiment's going to fail, and then you're going to decide, oh, we already tried, serving developing countries. Let's give up on 99% of the growth market. That would be a bad way. But if you try, several different things, I think I was just talking with Michael here. For those of you who are familiar with missiology terms, and you have E1, E2, E3, and the idea is E2 is 2 people groups away. So you're most effective whenever you're 1 people group away from serving someone in missions, right? So the same type of thing happens in technology, where for APU, what I'm proposing is probably 2 disruptive innovations away, right? For University College, it's 1 away. So that's part of the reason why whenever I listed the, I suggested a skunk works project out of University College. Different schools are doing different things. You could try a mobile degree for China. You could try to do a partnership. This school in India, if depending on where it goes, they may want to have some regionally accredited institutions behind us, and we may need some partners on that. And so there's ways to just get your feet wet on some of those things.